any of you to be able to refer back to if it's needed. For those of you that don't know me, I am Emily Kent, Head of Economy, Skills and Culture for Cornwall Council and SRO for Community Renewal Fund. There are a number of the members of the team that are working on Community Renewal Fund on the webinar today, and they'll each introduce themselves as we go through. If I could ask you to please mute yourselves if you haven't done already and turn your videos off. And if you've got any questions as we are going through the slides, if you could put them into the chat bar, please. And if you see questions in the chat bar, rather than repeating them, if you could use the like function on the questions to be able to flag those that you would most like a response to, and we'll make sure that we respond within the webinar to the most popular questions. And for those that we don't have time to respond to, we'll be updating the FAQs on the Community Renewal Fund pages on the Cornwall Council website with any of those additional responses and information. We've got about an hour and a half this morning to run through the objectives of the fund, the activities that Cornwall Council have prioritised, and the thinking behind those. So by the end of the session, the timetable, practical steps, and the support available to you to apply for this funding will hopefully be clear, and there will be plenty of time for us to get through as many of those questions as we can around the fund and the process. So with that, I will hand over to Stacey to take us through the fund detail.
Thank you, Emily. So hi, I think quite a few of you probably know me. I'm Stacey Sleeman. I'm the People and Prosperity Manager working for Cornwall Council, and also have a role with the LEP in terms of skills, programmes and advice. So quite a few of you probably know me from European Social Fund projects previously. And we are also leading the Community Renewal Fund project with lots of other different members of the team as well. So as Emily has said, what we aim to do today is cover the objectives that you can see on the screen in front of you today. Hopefully we'll be able to run through where the fund has come from, what the role of Cornwall Council is, and the slight themes that we've put in there to respond to some local priorities. The timetable, and most importantly have the opportunity in a little while to hear your questions and be able to respond to those as well, and obviously to encourage some interest in the fund also. So Kathy, if we could move to the next slide please. Okay, so Community Renewal Fund, the government announced this as part of their budget on the 3rd of March 2021. It's a national programme totalling £220 million. What it means for Cornwall is that we can look to support people and communities most in need across Cornwall and the UK. It's also looking at creating opportunities to trial new localised approaches and innovative ideas. The funding is only available for the current financial year, and what this is hoped to be is the precursor to the Government Shared Prosperity Fund, which is the bigger value funding that should be announced during the next year, and should then hopefully help us replace some of the European Social Fund that will be lost to the local area. What it means for us is that the government has given the council a lead authority role. So for a lead authority role, that means that we are asking for and appraising bids through this Community Renewal Fund process. And we have assigned a couple of priorities from a local perspective to that fund. So that's town centre and rural and coastal vitality, and reducing the digital divide. Each local area has up to £3 million worth of that total £220 million funding pot. So that means that we can bid for up to £3 million from the National Community Renewal Fund pot. For a minimum value of around 500,000, it's 90% revenue funding and 10% capital, and the funding will be allocated competitively by the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. Next slide, please. Okay, so what does this mean for Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly? As you all know, because you're on our webinar, we launched our open call process on the 6th of April. and we have quite tight timescales assigned to us by government. So that means that we are closing this call on the 7th of May at midnight. And we expect all application forms to be submitted using the application form that you can find on our website, which is the standard government application form. That needs to be submitted to the Community Renewal Fund email address that you can see there. The project activity for all of those applications need to align with the Community Renewal Fund prospectus, and within that prospectus you'll see those 4 investment priorities there. So that's investment in skills, business, communities in place, and supporting people into employment. What we've done in Cornwall is we've actually invited applications around themed projects based on our strategic documents that you will see in our bidding document, which is also on the website. And that quite clearly sets out that because of our priorities traditionally, but also because of some of the priorities that have arisen through the pandemic and the crisis that we've currently gone through, that we're quite keen to look at projects that will help us to support town centre, rural and coastal vitality and reducing the digital divide. The government documentation is quite clear that they will be looking for projects around £500,000. It's quite clear in that documentation that they're looking for larger scale applications, which is good for them to assess and appraise, but also then for us to manage and administer at this end when they come through. We're aware that this is a high value for quite a number of projects, so we're looking for as close to £500,000 as possible, but we are aware that there might be some local providers that are keen to come in with something a little bit less than that, and that will be appraised accordingly. All project activity needs to be completed by the 31st of March 2020, so that means that we are looking for projects to practically complete by mid-March so that we can process funding and make sure that the money is out of the door by the 31st of March 2022. So practically that means that projects probably need to commence in August, September time, depending on government appraisal processes, and then complete in that mid-March window. So we're looking for around a 6-month project of around £500,000. We're keen to make sure that projects avoid duplication with existing projects or programmes, and that the projects seek to look at opportunities to fill gaps, address challenges from COVID-19, and very importantly, pilot new approaches. And we encourage collaborative bids, and that encouragement is mainly due to understanding the delivery aspects of submitting a £500,000 bid and also making sure that it can be practically complete by that mid-March window, as we've said previously. If we can move on, please, Kathy. Okay, so these are just some examples that you can find in the technical bidding document, which is on the CRF website. It just gives you some examples of what we're looking for in terms of those different investment priorities there. So I won't go through all of those, but there are some examples there in front of you at the minute in terms of what we're looking for projects to focus on around that rural and town vitality, but also the digital divide aspect as well. As Emily has said, these slides will be available after the event on the website, so you can go back in and have a look at those as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so in terms of rural and coastal vitality, we're really keen to look at innovation in tackling town centre decline, reinvigorating high streets and creating opportunities and tackling deprivation in Cornwall's rural and coastal areas. So some activities there could include some innovation and pipeline projects. It could look at some feasibility studies within your local areas and towns, and it could also look at place shaping opportunities to really focus in on some of those real issues that town centres, rural and coastal areas are struggling with at the minute, particularly on the back foot of COVID-19, and how we can help reinvigorate some activities within those areas. Next slide, please. And then it comes to reducing digital divide. So again, we're looking for innovative solutions to address the challenges of digital exclusion, data poverty and connectivity. Really looking to maximise the opportunities presented through digital approaches to business diversification and transformation, and also around employment and skills and careers and enterprise outcomes. So the type of activities could include, these are just examples, but could include how we can look at local hubs, personal action plans for people, how the fund can support both training, skills, connectivity. All of those things are an opportunity under this scheme, and you can look at both business and people and capital and revenue opportunities in one project that you may not have been able to do previously under different funding regimes. Next slide, please. Okay, so in terms of eligibility, all of this again is really clear. Oh, my apologies. David, this is your slide actually.
Okay, thank you, Stacey. Good morning, everybody. For those that don't know me, I'm David Rodder, Economic Growth Manager at Cornwall Council, and I'm working with Emily and Stacey and other colleagues on this process. So I'm going to take you through a couple of slides now about our application and appraisal process. As Stacey said, Cornwall Council's the lead authority, so our role is to invite bids from a range of project applicants through an open process, which we launched a week or so ago, and this webinar is part of. We've then got to appraise and prioritise those bids up to a maximum value of 3 million, and the information available on the website has got a scoring criteria outlined on it. Once we've selected the projects that are in our bid, we've got to undertake due diligence checks to see whether the successful bidders or the people that we're proposing to work with can actually deliver, and there haven't been any changes between submission and to us and our when we plan to submit to government. We've then got to submit our shortlist of projects to government, put them all together in a bid for funding, and it is government's decision about whether they are approved or not. From what we understand of the process, we could get our bid to government could be approved. That's obviously the best case scenario in full. So we ask for 3 million and we get 3 million. It could be rejected in full, or we believe that they may come back and say, well, you asked for 3, but you can only have 2.5. So all of those kind of scenarios are likely. Subject to a successful bidding process, the lead authority's role is to then award contracts to the successful applicants, manage the payments, and monitor contract performance. As Stacey said, bids to us must be submitted using the application form, which is available on our website and has got to be submitted to the email address there. And they must be received by midnight on the 7th of May. Any late submissions, we will not be able to accept them. A lot of the scheme documentation is available on the government website for the UK Community Renewal Fund, which is there in the web link. And just to say, it is a competitive process. It's a competitive process to us in terms of we have to select the bids that will deliver best value for money. And it's also a competitive process for us compared to all the other local authorities in the area that are bidding in for funds. So we have to put in a strong bid. The bid assessment team, so my team and the team at Cornwall Council and government are not able to enter into discussions with bidders other than to seek clarifications or undertake due diligence. Next slide, please. Eligibility is, again, in the prospectus, it's any legally constituted organisation can apply. That can be on their own, or it can be in a consortium with a lead applicant. and it can include local authorities, public sector, and private sector companies, although private sector companies cannot bid in just for their own benefit. Private enterprises and charities can apply when they're providing a service or benefit to other organisations or individuals, not just themselves. And because the funding is predominantly revenue, 90% revenue, any projects that focus predominantly on large-scale construction or major refurbishment will not be supported. As I said, we're quite happy to accept bids from consortiums, but there has to be a lead partner. And in terms of geographical coverage, all of Cornwall is eligible, but project applicants can bring forward projects that cover the whole of Cornwall or a specific area of Cornwall or specific areas of Cornwall. That's up to you as the applicants. Again, please check the eligibility against the published prospectus on the government website. Next slide, please.
Morning, everybody. For those who don't know me, I'm Gareth Beer. I'm Head of Development at Cornwall Development Company. And again, for those who don't know, CDC, Cornwall Development Company, part of the CoreServe Group, which is a group of arm's length companies owned by Cornwall Council. As the slide here says, Cornwall Council has asked CDC to provide support to prospective applicants into the Community Renewal Fund. CDC, just in terms of background, as an organisation, we've got quite a lot of relevant recent experience in this field. We were heavily involved in providing guidance and support to applicants, or have been over the last 5 years under the European the growth programme, the Cornwall and Isles Scilly growth programme. And actually, the application forms, for those who've looked through them, there are quite a lot of similarities between the CRF application form and the associated guidance with some of the approaches adopted with European funding. So hopefully CDC's involvement here will be quite useful. The other point to pick up, as David mentioned just now, Cornwall Council, because of the role that they need to play in terms of the bid receipt, assessment and evaluation process, can't get involved in detailed discussions with prospective applicants about the detail of their projects or their emerging thoughts and ideas. So again, part of what we found quite useful under the European programmes was to provide that facilitation support so that CDC becomes a point of contact, a sounding board as applications are being developed. And just to say, it kind of follows on from what I just mentioned, all discussions with prospective applicants are dealt with on a strictly confidential basis, so applicant to applicant. No details of projects or thoughts or ideas or the name of applicants will be passed on to anybody else unless there's a particular reason for do that, and that would be with the applicant's specific support. So just briefly in terms of the support that we can provide, I'd say basic support and guidance around the requirements of the application forms and the processes. There's quite a lot of supporting information and technical guidance, all of which actually is very readable, digestible, and very useful. But what we found again with the European funding process was that it's quite useful for people to be able to kind of ask questions, where to go to find information, signposting to the right places in the guidance, and that type of thing proved to be quite useful previously. So we'll offer that service again here. As I mentioned, really be the main point of contact in terms of the application stage of the process for any kind of questions and queries that prospective applicants have as they're going along and filling in the application form. And then the second bullet point on the slide, part of the role that we've been asked to provide with CRF is to provide potential links and connections between applicants and other partners who might want to join forces to submit a bid, and that could be either because there's a need to come together to create projects of sufficient scale, and or to strengthen the proposal by bringing in a broader range of projects or partners. So in that instance, we've actually contracted into CDC some additional dedicated support in the form of a gentleman who some of you might know, Jim Cooper, who's an independent consultant, and Jim's been specifically tasked with providing that kind of brokerage partnership support role. So I think that's pretty much all I wanted to say. My contact details are on the slide. Ideally, if apart from people who've already expressed interest and have been attended to already, the best way of making contact in the first instance is through going through the council's web page, the CRF web page, and through the dedicated email address there. That hopefully will mean that nobody kind of gets lost in transition along the way. So I'll pass on to the next slide.
I think this is one for David again.
Yes, it is. Thank you. So once we receive the bids on the 7th of May, or by midnight on the 7th of May, the gateway criteria we're going to use are outlined in the Community Renewal Fund's prospectus. Any bids that fail those will fail those gateway criteria, are ineligible support and will be rejected. We've got to look at the extent to which any bid meets the objectives of the UK Community Renewal Fund. Those are the national objectives, which Stacey outlined earlier. And then at a local level, we will be looking at the extent to which the bids support the delivery of our two local priorities, town centre and rural coastal vitality, and reducing the digital divide. As far as town centre and rural coastal vitality are concerned, the council undertook a couple of inquiries recently and produced a town centre vitality inquiry report, which had a number of recommendations in it. And then earlier this year, they also finalised a rural and coastal vitality inquiry with a number of recommendations. So the documents from those inquiry panels will be a good reference point. Reducing the digital divide, then that's again something which is in both of those documents, and we'll be looking at both attainment levels or access levels, just as well as connectivity. The assessment weightings we published on our in the scoring criteria on the website. I'm sure there'll be some questions on that in the chat bar in a moment, but we have weighted the scores, so you'll be able to see how we will assess your bids. The weightings are around national and local strategic fit. Deliverability is key, as you will have noticed if you've read the prospectus. The delivery window for the Community Renewal Fund is extremely tight. So if we get an offer letter or are able to begin delivery in August of this year, everything has to be delivered by March 2022. So deliverability is absolutely key. We'll also be looking at obviously the effectiveness of that delivery, because we want quality delivery, not just any delivery, and also looking at quality and diversity in any submission as well. Further information on our bid assessment is on our website, and the link is there in the presentation. And then following the assessment, we will submit an application that includes the eligible bids, which we feel most strongly fit the UK Renewal Fund national and local priorities, up to a maximum of £3 million, and that will be submitted by the 18th of June. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And so in terms of the timetable that we have set out, so you'll see that we've had the open call, which has been published. We're in the webinar at the moment, which is the 19th of April. The 7th of May application deadline is the end of the day on the 7th of May. So I noticed a question coming up there. So just for clarification, it is the end of the day on the 7th of May in terms of midnight. So 11:59, I imagine. And then in terms of what we then need to do, we need to assess, appraise and shortlist those application forms, as we have said, for the 18th of June. Government have committed that they will notify us of their successful appraisal processes from the end of July. So we're hoping that that means the end of July, so that we can then very quickly look to issue funding agreements and move to the contract management and project delivery phase, with projects ending on the 31st of March, as we've said. Next slide, please. Okay, so then in terms of the role that we have at the back end of the process, as I've said, we're hopeful that we will get sufficient time from government to allow us to issue funding agreements, hopefully August, in the latest September 2021. We will look at issuing standard funding agreements to successful projects, and those funding agreements will cover all of those bullet points below. So payment schedules, how we will collect and review performance and financial reporting, the outcomes and measures associated with those projects and how that will tie back into payment schedules. There will also be things around branding and publicity. So you will have noticed in the government documentation that if you're a successful project, there's quite strict rules around how you use government branding and tweets and all of those types of things. The roles and responsibilities of both the council and the project deliverer, and any risk associated there in terms of risk registers and submissions back to us. So as we've said, we're hopeful that projects will be able to kick off in August or September 2021. Government will have a mid-point delivery review with us as lead authority in November and December, and we would then want to have that midpoint delivery review with project partners as well. And then we're looking for the 15th of March to be practical completion for all of those projects, for the reasons that we've set out previously, in terms of making sure that we can draw down funding from government for the final pieces of those projects and make sure that we can get the money out of the door within the current financial year. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're now able to start looking at questions. So I think we're going to take the slides down, and then the panel can put all of our videos on so that we can have a look at some of the questions that are coming through. And I think, Kathy, what you're going to do for us, thank you very much, is just to run through the questions, maybe pose those to the panel, and we will try our best to respond to them accordingly. So if you're not on the panel, it'd be fantastic if you could take your video off at the moment, turn your videos off unless you are on the panel answering questions, and then we can take it from there. So Kathy, have you got any would you be able to start running through the ones that
yeah, sure. So as they've been coming in now, I think this has already been covered off by Gareth and his part with CDC and the support that's available, but asking about expressions of interest for smaller organisations who wish to be project partners and do not have the capacity to be lead applicants. I think we've answered that, but Gareth, I don't know if you want to add anything to it.
Yeah, by all means, thanks. So the partnership service that we're offering really is designed to kind of fulfil that function exactly. So what I'd recommend is that again, if you can make contact through the council's, the email address on the council CRF webpage, in the first instance, that that flags you to provide one of two kind of responses. One is whether you need applicant support, as in help and support with the application form itself. The second is to flag whether you're looking for partnership support to work with somebody else. So in either instance, those inquiries will come through to myself and to Jim Cooper, I mentioned in my presentation, and then we'll work with individual applicants, look at the details of what they're looking to do, and then try and match you up with other organisations where there might be some benefits or synergies in working together. But obviously we need to do that on the basis that you're giving your consent for us to make those connections, which we can deal with through kind of correspondence. So does that answer the question?
Thanks, Gareth. Yes. So we've got a few questions coming in about sort of payments and, you know, funding and technically how that's going to work. There's one question here about, are we considering payments by beneficiary or on evidence of defrayal of costs? I don't know, Stacey or David probably for that one.
Yeah, so in terms of payment schedules, what the government are proposing is that they will give the lead authority 50% of the total costs of those projects at the start of the project delivery, and then the final 50% will be given to the lead authority on completion of projects. What we're currently working through is how we can best then come up with payment schedules that are reflective of cash flow and local organisational structures, so that if you are able and you're a larger organisation to cash flow a bit more appropriately, then we will look at maybe a monthly or a quarterly payment schedule based on evidence and defrayal of costs. What we're keen to understand in your application process is where you believe that there will be cash flow issues, that you can alert those to us in the application process, so that then we can look to support that wider delivery network. If you are a smaller organisation or cash flow issues might be a problem, so that then we can negotiate with our internal approvals process to make sure that, one, we're being helpful as an organisation to make sure that we can support local project delivery organisations, but also that we are apportioning risk both for the local authority and for project providers appropriately, so that the council isn't too much at risk. So yeah, that's what we'll be looking at, but I think in particular we will be looking at evidence of defrayal of costs for those programmes going forward.
Okay, we got some questions here coming in about value for money too, in terms of how we will be evaluating projects in terms of their value for money. David, that's probably a question for you, I guess.
Yes, thank you. The other thing I would just add on that previous question is of course, as part of the contract is going to have to be on delivery. So Stacey said about risk. The risk of non-delivery is being passed down by government to the local authority, to us. So whilst there might be the opportunity to cash flow up front, if required, there's also going to be a need to deliver results, because if we have non-delivery, then that is problematic. So I think it will be a mix of evidence required, particularly later on as we get towards the closure of the period. In terms of value for money, the assessment criteria form that we have is published. We're going to be looking at the value for money score is within the overall efficiency of delivery, and it's got a weighting of 10% in our scoring process. We'll be looking at has it got an efficient mode of delivery? Is there any innovation in there? Because if it is particularly innovative, it might perhaps be more expensive per beneficiary than standard delivery. You know, we would look at that. Is it going to operate at an appropriate scale? Do the costs look what we would expect or not? What's the level of outputs, of course, you know, in terms of if a project comes in and wants £1,000 per beneficiary and another one wants £2,000, well, you'll per beneficiary you know which is going to get the better value for money score on that measure. And also it's about whether it's clear that the project would not proceed without funding. So government, it's in the prospectus, they are looking for additionality. They don't want this just to be replacing existing funding. They want to see new delivery delivered by the community renewal funds. We will be looking for that.
Just a follow-up one on that as well. I noticed that there's a lot of questions coming in around match funding. So there isn't a requirement for match funding within the Community Renewal Fund's prospectus, but it does say that projects will be looked at more favourably if projects can bring some match funding to parties. So obviously that will form part of that assessment as well. So just for clarification, there isn't a requirement for match funding, but of course that will have to filter through into the value for money assessment as we undertake that in the authority.
Thanks, Stacey. So can this funding actually be used in conjunction with other funding? So there's a question here particularly around the support that's been announced for Truro.
Shall I maybe respond to that initially, and then the team can add some further detail? So notwithstanding Stacey's point around match not being required, of course, using funding that is already available will add to the value for money assessment for projects, and clearly adds to the deliverability of those. I think the challenge for Community Renewal Fund and aligning it with other funds that are available is the short delivery time scale. So for match funding that is already approved, that would seem to be useful and helpful join up, and would certainly impact positively in terms of the assessment. However, the timescales wouldn't allow for other funding to be applied for and sought, and those timescales in terms of aligning within those 6 months, unless the other funds timescales were on a similar trajectory. So consideration needs to be given very carefully to bringing in direct match funding if those timescales aren't aligned. I think in terms of the announcement around Truro's town deal, for example, that funding will be in development with business cases being written for those projects over the next 12 months. So much of that won't start delivering until much later in 2021, and therefore the timescales for those funds directly being linked within the same activity will be challenging. However, clearly there are clear links between the types of activity and the overall outcomes that are being delivered in places that are indirectly related to each other, and that's also a key consideration in terms of the fit of Community Renewal Fund with wider activity that's happening, and a strategic approach to delivering support against the themes that have been prioritised. The other funding that many on the call will be aware of is the Cornwall Council's Town Centre Revitalisation Fund. And clearly, given that the timescales for that funding is a little bit more within the gift of Cornwall Council, there may be some links that we can make there collectively around support for places and for towns linked to the priority on town centre and rural and coastal vitality, where we can bring those two together and the activities can work together in partnership.
There's just another question coming on value for money from Andrew Finley about interpreting my response. I only use the beneficiary costs as an example. It could be we could be looking at different outcomes. So I don't think we will just be looking at cost per beneficiary. We will be looking at the wider overall outcomes in the value for money calculations.
Thanks, David. Thank you, Emily. We've got another question here coming in about obviously some projects might be using volunteers as part of their programme delivery. So we've got a question about full cost recovery being used in lieu of salary cost. I don't know who'd like to have a go at answering that one.
I would probably need to have a really good look at the technical advice. So apologies if I get this wrong. So I will probably make sure that you have a look back through that technical advice for project applicants, which is on the Community Renewal Fund website there. But yes, my understanding is that you need to make up the project and assign costs based on those projects. And I believe that volunteer time, I think there was another question there around kind of seconding stuff from one project to another, for example, or from a different organisation. I believe that all of those things are possible. So the eligibility requirements and the restrictions that we have faced with the ESIF programme are not as burdensome in the Community Renewal Fund from my understanding of it. So it is about you working through how your project can deliver within your existing or new resources, and then working through how those project costs are assigned, and then I believe those costs should be fully recoverable through the process, unless any of the other panel have different interpretation on that. That's my understanding on how projects can kind of pull their projects together and then lead to cost recovery.
I think just to add to that, Stacey, I think just for people's ease of reference, the technical guidance note is reasonably kind of specific on pages 6 and 7 about what the fund can support. So it doesn't go into the detail of volunteer time, but it certainly talks about, you know, what's in scope within revenue, staff costs, and how staff costs should be recorded and accounted for, and things like overheads. So certainly encourage anybody who's thinking of applying to read the technical guidance. It's not massively long, probably from cover to cover, because there's some quite useful information in there.
Thank you for that. So we've got sort of various questions still coming in around the funding. So Kate Reed is asking if there's any clarification on profiles or schedule in order to help projects assess sort of cash flow requirements, and whether outcome-led payments or whether it will be full cost recovery. Probably a question for David, perhaps.
Yes, happy to cover that one. Stacey mentioned the way that government are proposing to work with lead applicants is their 50% of the funding of our successful bid will come to the council up front, and we're willing to accommodate, I think, options for how we work with the successful bidders about what they need. I think Emily mentioned if it's a larger organisation that's able to cash flow, then it's easier if it's on defrail or on output delivery or outcome delivery on results, basically. But for other organisations where cash flow, the availability of cash flow is a limiting factor for them being involved, we could look at other options as well, because we certainly wouldn't want the lack of cash flow to stop an innovative project going forward. If in your application form, if you do have a specific cash flow requirement, then please log it in that form so that we can see it. And then that would be if you one of the successful bidders that we put forward into our bid to government, that I think would be one of the due diligence checks that we would undertake, or discussions we would have with that successful bidder about how that cash flow might work.
Thanks. So I'm not sure we've covered this off now, but it's around using other funding as match funding. So there's an example giving here of DEFRA Future Farming Resilience Fund. Would it be eligible as match funding? And then from Aurelie also around using other programs like our own ESIF funding that's still existing and out there, or Kickstart being used as match.
I can cover the farm resilience funding, as I think both Emily and Stacey have said. If you've got match funding or funding that can be aligned into the project, that will improve your value for money scores. And yes, I believe the farming resilience fund can be used as match funding for this funding.
My view around the European Social Fund and Kickstart funding would probably be that wouldn't be acceptable based on the most recent experiences we've had through the PA1 group and the feedback that we've had around that. I think that it would be seen as duplication of effort, because quite a lot of the outcomes associated with the Community Renewal Fund could be being delivered as part of existing European Social Fund projects. I think that the only way it would be suitable would be if it was to provide very different added value or innovations over and above what's already contracted. So my gut instinct, I mean, Emily might know a bit more than I do, is that it's probably best to steer clear of kind of growth funding, European growth programme funding, just because it will tie us up in knots, as it has done previously with looking at the same kind of DWP funding routes that have very similar outcomes and outputs.
Can I just add there, just in terms of the guidance at the end of the application form itself, page 16, for reference, Part 3 funding package. Match funding is any other funding, any funding other than funding from the UK Community Renewal Fund that will be used to meet project costs. So I think the challenge is if you're repurposing funding that's already been allocated to another project, you know, I guess the question would be how is that meeting specific project costs to do with the Community Renewal Fund project? But I think that the scope of potential kind of match funding is fairly broad, but I think that probably is something to focus down on, particularly as Emily said earlier on. The delivery time frame for CRF is very short, so I think it's brings some challenges with it, I think.
Thank you for that. Just to repeat that actually about the short delivery window and the focus on revenue here, we've got a question about existing staff and can they be redeployed into a CRF project, and would there be a backfill requirement as per ESIF? Just recognising that recruiting staff for a 6-month contract could be a challenge. Who'd like to answer that?
I'm happy to have a go at that, but I'm not the expert. I just referred back to sorry to keep referring to the guidance, but section 5 of the technical guidance certainly would imply to me that staff who, well, it says paragraph 5.6 says where staff are engaged in CRF project activity for part of their working hours, their costs should be charged to the CRF project on a percentage basis. So by inference, that looks like, you know, the kind of redeployment or deployment of existing staff is something that's within scope for CRF, but you need to record the time that's being spent on the CRF project for evidence purposes and be able to account for it. And there's a worked example at the bottom of paragraph 5.6 in that paper that shows how that can work. So hopefully that's helpful.
Just adding to that, Gareth, there's also in that is around how your overheads are covered, and MHCL or MHCLG are only accepting 15% of staff costs. There's no other methodologies allowed. So there are lots of methodologies for calculating overheads, but MHCLG are only going to allow the 15% on staff costs. There's nothing in the guidance that I can read about the need to backfill the post. So I think that might be a specific European Structural Investment Fund rule, not a Community Renewal Fund rule. So yeah, that's my understanding of the rules anyway.
Lovely, thank you. So we've got a question here. How much the total fund with the panel hope to bring to Cornwall? I think that's probably the full 3 million, isn't it? I don't think anybody got anything more to that to add to that. No. Okay. Kate, again, are we expecting the evidence requirements for outcomes and outputs to be similar to ESIF? Obviously, there's a lot of experience here around ESIF, so what the difference is really.
In the technical notes, I'll pick that up at the back end of the technical note. It has the core outcome indicators and how they're defined, and the unit of measurement. So yes, we'll be using those.
So Annette here has obviously quite rightly pointed out that capital funding under this fund is very limited. I think there's only 10%. So is there any other funding for capital funding that might be able to, projects might be able to utilise? Does anybody know?
There's lots of different funding streams coming through. There's nothing particularly that we have launched locally or nationally that's different from things that you will already be aware of through either the European Growth Programme or different opportunities there. I am aware, and Emily will have more detail, sorry Emily, of things that are upcoming. So there are different funding streams that government are announcing over the coming years which might be able to offer different capital opportunities, and we will naturally then be able to bring those to the market and support them if we have a role to play like we do within the Community Renewal Fund. But I don't think there's something specifically capital related at the moment that we're working on outside of what is already out there through the kind of different funding streams that we know of.
Thank you. So a question from Jonathan about the perspective of the Cornwall local priorities, and of course, as we know, heard through the presentation, there's two, but will we be highlighting the outcomes that we are sort of most interested in supporting?
No. So what we have said is that we want to stay as true to the national investment priorities, so the 4 investment priorities, and then the outcomes associated with those, as David has said, can be found at the back of that technical guidance. What we're more keen to see is that projects look to help tackle using those range of different investment priorities that best fit with your project and your local problem and therefore solution. To help tackle digital divide issues and also those town centre and rural vitality projects as we see fit. So it is very much about, you could look at one of the investment themes, you could look at all 4. It's very much about what your problem and solution will be through that project development.
Thank you. So does the fund include the Isles of Scilly, and would it be advantageous if bids included the islands? So I think that's probably a yes, but in terms of would it be advantageous at all?
No, the Community Renewal Fund, the Isles of Scilly, is dealt with as a separate applicant. So they will be making, I assume, they will be making their own application. I don't think there would be anything to stop a project in Cornwall also applying to do similar activity on the Isles of Scilly, but that would be a separate application.
Okay, that's news to me. Thank you.
And I think I'm right in saying government prioritised different areas of the country, and under this fund, the Community Renewal Fund, Cornwall is a priority 1 area, but the Isles of Scilly is a priority 2 area. There was also a question I saw, Kathy, when I was looking through on confirming the submission deadline, because we've said midnight on the 7th of May. I think by that we mean midnight in the evening, not midnight in the morning. So 11:59 and 59 seconds probably is what we should have put for clarity.
Thank you, David. Thank you. And another one probably for you, David, because I know you mentioned it earlier about where can someone find the town centre vitality reports that you mentioned? Are those publicly available?
Yes, they are. I'm pretty sure we put the links in our documents to them, but if not, they'll be available on the council website. The council website has just been renewed though, so if anybody's having trouble finding them, I think what we'll do is put the links to them in the frequently asked questions. That would probably be the best way of doing it to make sure everybody has got them.
Thank you. So and again, sort of question around match funding still coming in. Is match funding a must? And if it isn't, will this be favourable in the assessment under value for money?
Yeah, so match funding is not a must. The prospectus is quite clear that you do not have to bring match funding to the table, but the prospectus does also say that where match funding is available, that will also mean that value for money is better. So that will be taken into account. So I assume both, well, I know with our own assessments, and then for those shortlisted to government will also probably look more favourably on those with match funding. It's confusing because it says it's not a must, but it will be included in the value for money assessment.
If I just add in there, just referring to the guidance again, as David mentioned earlier on, there's the assessment process is one of is published and is one of the supporting documents that are available through the CRF webpage on the Cornwall Council website. There's a series of criteria, so it sets out the way in which projects are going to be assessed. Criteria 2 is around deliverability, effectiveness and efficiency, and number 3 of the sub-criteria talks about match funding. So it says projects are likely to score higher where they, and there are a series of bullet points. The second one is about value for money. So it says demonstrate value for money, taking account of the level of contribution to programme outputs for funding sought and the amount of match funding or leverage proposed to maximise impact. So as Stacey says, it's not a requirement, but it's clear in the assessment criteria that match is going to form part of the value for money assessment.
Thank you. So I think that sort of concludes the Q&A for today. Obviously, the Community Renewal Fund website page on the Cornwall Council is available, and people can sort of still submit their questions via the email account that we set up for that. If we just go back to the remaining presentation slides, if you just bear with me a minute while I bring them back up.
While you're doing that, Kathy, there's another question around more precision around programme output numbers for value for money. I said the definitions are clear in the guidance of what is. I don't think we have a preset idea for what the cost per beneficiary or the cost per output or outcome should be. That's what we're looking for businesses or bidders to come forward with. So no, we can't give you a figure that we're looking at, a magic figure that we're saying, well, if you score, if you provide above this, you'll score higher than below. We'll be looking for bidders to come forward with their costs, in the knowledge that if you're targeting the hardest to reach in very rural areas, yeah, that might come with a higher cost than if you were doing it in an urban area, for example.
Lovely, thank you. I've just popped the slides back up. Hopefully you can all see that, and I'll hand back to Emily to make a close.
Thank you, Kathy, and thank you very much to the team and to you all for joining today. I hope that's been helpful clarification. So the links are there for the Community Renewal Fund webpage on the Cornwall Council website. If you haven't managed to scribble down what is quite a long URL, if you go to the Cornwall Council website and in the search bar put in Community Renewal Fund, the top search that comes up, it will take you straight to that page as well. The email address is there for anyone that wants further clarification or to access any of that further support, and Gareth's email address for directly contacting him on support as well. And we will capture all of those comments and add detail into the FAQs with further clarification and explanation on any of those that we haven't fully responded to and those that we have. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you. And a copy of the slides and a recording from this event today will be put up on the website.